Your Holiness, thank you so much for making the time today. This is a meeting the likes of which we've never had before. It is a meeting to celebrate the transition between generations.
Yes. You, I think, between there.
Well, maybe a little. Starting to get gray hair.
Oh, yes.
So every one of these wonderful young people has received a Varela Award, and I'd like to just reflect collectively for a few moments on Francisco Varela's legacy. We are really all here because of his vision to start the Mind and Life Institute, and all of these young people are working in the tradition that he began. And one of the amazing things in my own personal life that's happened is that Francisco's son, Gabriel, will be living with us next year in Madison, because he will be studying sociology at the University of Wisconsin, and we invited him to come live with us, and so it just closes the loop, and I feel very wonderful that we can share that with him. But these young people have benefited from all the work that has come before. One of the things that we'll talk about today is findings in a broad spectrum of research on contemplative studies, not just contemplative neuroscience, but as you'll see, there's a really diverse areas of interest. All of these.
Yes.
So the diverse range of topics is unified by a commitment to an integrative way of knowing, which is so important to Mind and Life. An integrated way of knowing that combines the first and third person accounts, which is something that Francisco, of course, was so well known for. All of these scientists also have a commitment to their own contemplative practice, and so by themselves merging these modes of knowing, I think they bring more wisdom to the problems that they are studying. And we'll hear about them today. So the format for this afternoon is each of them is going to give a short presentation, not more than 10 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for discussion for each one, and we'll just have each of them present.
Very good.
Okay, thank you, Baljinder.
Thank you.
We'll now move on. Our next presenter is Dave Vago. Dave has also been with Mind and Life for quite a long time, and very much grew up in the Mind and Life family. He received his PhD from the University of Utah, and he's now on the faculty at Harvard Medical School.
Well, it's a blessing to be here with you, Your Holiness, so thank you, much gratitude. I also have a gift, and I won't spend much time with it, but it's a gift from the Lakota Sioux people, Native American people.
No, they do.
And it's a drum that they made for you. And there's a letter in there as well.
Good, thank you. Just I met with a group of Native people.
San Diego.
San Diego. Oh.
Well, it's an honor for them to share this as a gift for what everything you do.
Thank you.
If he speaks too long, we can start banging him.
Yes.
Okay, so I will actually talk today about models and mechanisms for mindfulness.
Oh, dear. Yes.
So generally speaking, I make a contrast here between two paths for cultivating mindfulness in the context of meditation practice. One is a 2,500-year-old model that's depicted here in the Tanka from actually the wall of Norbolinka, and the 25-year-old model that comes, that's heavily influenced by John Kabat-Zinn's adaptation of Buddhist practices. So the good news really is the concept of mindfulness is been all over popular culture. That's the good news. But the not so good news is that the concept of mindfulness is somewhat trivialized, and sometimes the concept is also often conflated with terms like attention and awareness. And so there's also problems with how we define mindfulness. And we define it now in the field of contemplative science in multiple ways. We have 8 different measures of self-report of how we define mindfulness, and that are often uncorrelated with each other. We sometimes define mindfulness. Sometimes mindfulness is defined as a state that is cultivated during the practice, or as an enduring trait that has some sort of dispositional changes in cognition and behavior. But also it's described as a practice. People say, I practice mindfulness meditation. So this is a problem in the laboratory setting, and my research focuses on this problem by coming up with a theoretical conceptual framework that we can try to elucidate what's happening exactly in the meditation practices that cultivate mindfulness. So a conceptual model is a way to sort of provide a systematic way to deconstruct a concept into its component parts, to sort of provide a representative map of what is happening when someone is practicing the specific practices in meditation. And so my colleagues and I have attempted first to come up with a way to model what's happening in these practices looking at focused attention meditation, for example, which would be something like shamatha or anapanasati, or a receptive type of meditation practice, which could be like vipassana, or a compassion type of practice. And we will look at these independently and come up with models for each one of these so we can then better understand mindfulness. So we first investigated the more contemporary pathway, and we found that people who go through these 8-week courses actually activate very specific areas of the brain, like Norm was alluding to, and we came up with very specific cognitive processes that we identified. So our next step really is to come up with these process models that describe what is happening in the practice itself. You thinking, elucidating the actual cognitive and neurobiological processes that are happening while you practice.
Cognitive and neurobiological.
Yes.
And so we really want to focus on how these processes can change over time from a novice to an expert. And that will give us sort of a developmental trajectory also of what happens in the brain as you change, as you practice. So in the next few... So in the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on a process model of vipassana practice, or it's some type of receptive practice. And I was hoping you would actually imagine yourself practicing the task for the first time. And so every cognitive process that I identify, I just want you to keep in mind also that each one of those processes has a specific neural substrate that you can investigate independently. And that is how we're going to sort of investigate mindfulness, by looking at each process independently. Okay? So the first part of the model refers to a framework of conditioning. Just like riding a bike or learning a musical instrument, we have to learn something, and the more you practice, the better you get. And this is very important for illustrating what happens when you practice meditation. In the second part, so I'm going to walk you through this whole process. The second part is foundational to the practice, and that's intention and motivation. So an altruistic form of motivation and a positive intention and orientation towards the practice is important. And so we want to be able to investigate that as well, independently from all the other processes. The second process here is a way of, it's called set formation, but it's really about the practice instructions that you were given. Whoever gave you your practice instructions for the first time, you had to interpret them and figure out, well, how do you do this? How do you sit? How will you actually do the practice? So then you actually have to use some form of what we call working memory. Well, let's stop there. Working memory, which allows you to take the actual instructions of and the working memory. And so the working memory allows you to sustain those instructions during the whole time that you're practicing and to avoid forgetfulness. And the ambient attention is a form of attention that allows you to have no specific object of concentration. So instead of focused attention on one particular object like the breath, now you're orienting your attention towards multiple types of modalities of experience. So what I have describing here is visual, auditory, and somatic. So the sense that you can have an external image, feeling. Yes, feeling. So it could be an internal sensation, which Norm was referring to. A lot of times it seems like the meditation improves our ability to detect internal sensation. But it can be also external in all these modalities, external or internal motivation. You can also, there's encouragement for the practice to mentally note and label these types of sensations that arise.
Yes.
So you can note the actual experience of the stimulus, of the object of concentration, or you can note the arising, the passing of the object, or you can sustain. Or you can sustain. Or you can sustain the attention towards the absence of those particular objects. Then, once it's noted and labeled, you can then disengage. And the idea here is that you're no longer engaging with that object, and you go right back into sort of an open awareness of whatever is happening, and to start again. And this is sort of an iterative process that continues. What can happen following this is also some sort of affective or emotional response can also happen with a different type. It can be a positive, negative, or neutral valence to the experience. And it can have a certain intensity or arousal, and this could also have autonomic or physiological changes that you can measure as well. And in conjunction with an affective response is typically an episodic memory, some sort of feeling state will also be associated with a memory of the retrieval of a past experience or projection of the future possibilities, some fantasy or worry about the future. And this is typically described as some sort of habit or automatic sort of response that comes up in your mind, typically. And Thorsten and Norm have both referred to this happening, this continual iterative process of rumination. Here I describe it as mental proliferation, but it can also be rumination is another way to describe this. And this can continue over and over again without stop, sometimes without awareness that it's happening. Now, if you're... Oh, sorry.
그래.
Now, the critical aspect of this model is a monitoring function. Now, the practice really encourages you to be able to monitor everything that's happening at once, and this also gives you some sort of your body, contributes to the body awareness as well. And the monitoring function is critical to allow you to have this decentering process happening. It's the distancing from oneself, the meta-awareness, the awareness of awareness. And what was critical to what Thorsten was also talking about for the people who are depressed was to then stop the cycle of rumination by decentering or psychological distancing. Okay, so this, and the decentering process has very specific processes that you can also measure, like response inhibition or emotion regulation. These are cognitive processes that you can measure in the brain, and we know where to look for those particular processes. And so we can look at those and see if they're strengthened. And then once you disengage from that mental proliferation, then you start again where you're supposed to be by mentally noting and labeling those objects of attention. And one other aspect, or three other aspects of the model that I've incorporated here is decreasing in the amount of effort over time. So I said we want to look at novices and experts, and over time the brains look very different from novices and experts. And so we really want to model this particular degree of effort.
Yes, that's right.
And then increases in levels of clarity and equanimity. Now these are seemingly important parts of the meditation practice, but we just don't understand them very well yet, what the clarity means or what equanimity, how it fits into the brain. And so altogether this is supposed to really develop some sort of insight, right? That's the goal of Vipassana practice. And over time, there's also there should be some sort of disappearance of mentally noting and labeling. It shouldn't be as important anymore to mentally note and label. That disappears. The same as disengagement from the object. That should also disappear over time. So this is really one model that describes one practice, Vipassana practice. We're trying to model other practices, and the goal is really to characterize all of these types of models to help contemplative research continue while also acknowledging the subtle, features of the practices themselves from the historical path, as well as integrating the newer, more contemporary path together. So my question really to you, Your Holiness, is whether you think there's something incomplete about this particular model, and how you think maybe mindfulness may fit into here, or if you see it maybe as also a sort of a way to describe the entire process.
남도 응어시 남도 제스마다체 아니 리버스 소방 맞죠 그래가도 샤소지 지시전에 이건데 디사지는 노아 야 시베 진다고 세리 잡지 마실 수도 그래야지 되겠지 그럴 수도 있지 요도
Someone's saying that's actually quite good. And it seems to capture more perhaps more appropriately, a particular form of shamatha practice focused on mind, mental processes, where the aim is to remain your attention focused on the mental processes without losing your attention and not letting your mind wander after any sensations that arises and then chase after it, but being able to rest in the nature of mind, and then gradually qualities like clarity particularly emerges.
시바를 군 진다를 연구로 진다 그 쇼데 마시면서 시바 그래 간이야. 소모 마시고 그래 간 돼야지.
So because when cognitive processes arise, there is a kind of a subjective component of it, which is taking on some kind of content, and the idea here is to disengage from the content, but at the same time rest in the actual experience of the mental state.
Good.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
다들 meditation 생각이 뒤고 간다 14호지 다 페이지 산스크리트 피 나로 다들 민지 페이지 몽골 줘 봐. 저저 또 내가 시작. 이 시에 민지 몽골 치다 저태디 미디어 안에 식지 다 다다 몽골지 다다 되지. 그것도 confuse 도 와.
One of the things that the researchers need to keep in mind is the partly has to do with the problem of translation across conceptual frameworks. So it's a problem of language. For example, we tend to use the word meditation in a very broad way in English context, whereas if you look at say, for example, the Tibetan sources, there are many specific terms which all of them together are translated as meditation. Similarly, when we have mental processes, again in English, one term is used, to capture the kind of idea of many other Tibetan terms. So this is something that we need to bear in mind, because otherwise it sort of leads to greater unclarity.
And scientists don't really have a good understanding of clarity. And one question I have, Dave, is whether clarity and equanimity are emergent properties from a particular state of the whole system rather than a portion of the whole model, of the model itself. That is, rather, it's a characteristic of the mind being in a certain configuration.
Yeah, it appears to be, at least because there's no direct cognitive process except for maybe perceptual acuity that sort of can describe clarity. We talk about phenomenal intensity. It's like a quality more than a component.
Cell rig said the yorda. The kuchubu. Serwa said Shiva Kanta Kana Shivati Kangi Nabajan Gayagi Nabari Givache Nawari Givache Lokshi in it, but the rule is the way in it, on Tenzi in it, Tendu Naji or Chazanga cousin. Shiva Kanta Kana Rang Nawachi. Now the Shivatel Mungurche. Tenzi in the Shivati Nawatala Muslim Cell said, you said. Rig said, you tea number Tedoki, number Sharve, Jeso, number T, Namjan to Shiva the Giveable and tea ribbons in the charge.
So in the Indo-Tibetan epistemology, mental phenomena is characterized as having primarily two properties: clarity and awareness. And clarity is really described more as the property of mental processes that has this, in some sense, reflexive element, where it is able to, in some sense, perceive what arises to it. So there is a kind of almost like a kind of a self-reflexive dimension to the mental processes, whereas the awareness element refers to the function of the mental processes, which is to cognize, to perceive, and to register. So maybe there is something there.
세상 awareness ati repeat 나체. 와다 self 전에 낭치 체험이지. 다 레벨은 그런 제조는 그렇게 보이는 것이다.
So His Holiness was saying, of course, he doesn't know how, he doesn't have a clue how these kind of things could be described at the level of brain.
I often used to feel, as a result of the several meetings, I've got the impression that those sort of consciousness of mind, which very much depend on brain movement, right? Deep hedge, brain is part of body. 그래서 루지 쉐발 저지 요되는 소리. 이들이 이러잖아요. 그러나 미기 원고 나온 것은 들리 루지 원고 켜고 있어서 되고. 들 루시 조지셔. 다 루시 그리들이 간다 레바든 저 시주시도 레바톤 샤운 좀 보지. 다 원고 쉐바도 만쟁에 숙제가 원고도 만쟁에 이완 된댕이 이 쉐바스럽도 Yes.
One of the differences between kind of the Western scientific kind of conceptualization. So far,
it is not very clear.
In the Western scientific conceptualization of mental phenomena, a distinction is not really made between sensory versus mental processes. And many of the descriptions, particularly from the neuroscience, is really coming from the brain systems. And looking from the Buddhist side,
or Indian psychology,
from the Indian tradition, one would expect that many of the mental experiences that we have that are very intimately connected to our sensory modalities will be connected to our body. So the somatic kind of experience would be much more pervasive. And those kind of experiences one would expect to have a much higher signature at the brain level. But then in the Indian tradition...
It is quite logical.
That's true.
Or it is logical, you see, investigate what change, what movement in brain level, then can say, now that kind of emotion develop, that kind of feeling develop. Now that's mainly sensory level consciousness and experience come from that. That's good.
So, however, in the Indian tradition, we also have the idea of non-sensory modality, which is the mental, domain. And in this domain, at this point, His Holiness was saying that it seems quite difficult to figure out what would the brain correlates of the experiences at that level.
but the compassion is
But interestingly, when we talk about compassion research, the compassion would be considered as being on the mental domain, but there seems to be strong brain correlates.
and of course, you see, fear, anger, these part of mental thing, but very much related with brain. So I think it's because of the joint effort
With collaboration.
Buddhist psychologists or Indian psychologists and Western scientists, I think a lot of things to carry research work.
So, Your Holiness, I'm mindful of time.